For several years I have studied the figure of the apostolic prothonotary Pietro Carnesecchi, whose biography was significant in the religious history of 16th century Italy. Carnesecchi did not write any theological works, except for a famous letter signed by Carnesecca on the sacrament of the Eucharist, in which he criticized both the Catholic Mass with the transubstantiation of the body of Christ and the Lutheran concept of consubstantiation. As I discovered in 2020, however, this epistle had not been written in 1543 by Carnesecchi, as has been believed until today, but almost 30 years later, when he was already dead. This text was probably produced by the circle of intellectuals and theologians who gravitated around Joachinus Camerarius, a humanist from Nuremberg, author of an encomium dedicated to Pietro Carnesecchi, and editor of some letters of Marcantonio Flaminio, the poet, theologian, follower of Juan de Valdés. Camerarius himself was at the center of a real network that promoted Lutheranism of Philippian origin, less rigid and intransigent, in the wake of Philip Melanchthon, and crucially connected the Germanic area with heterodox Italy. The letter in the name of Carnesecchi, pseudo-Carnesecchi, is the demonstration of the connection, still little known, between Lutherans and heterodox Italians after the Council of Trent. In those years, among other things, a theological treatise was published, which inflamed discussions among Lutherans. The Exegesis perspicua et ferme integra controversiae de sacra coena by Joachim Cureus, published posthumously in 1574, without typographical indication and without the name of the author. My research suggests that this text by Cureus comes from the Camerarius group and that it is connected with Carnesecchi's epistle. My paper today will analyze the relationships between Italy and Germany, in particular of Nuremberg and Leipzig, in the 1560s, via the Camerarius family. The aim of my paper is to shed new light on these relationships. By so doing, it makes 2 points in relationships to existing historiography. The first point relates to the chronology of Italian-German relation. Until today, Italian historiography, see Massimo Firpo, Gigliola Fragnito, Adriano Prosperi, Emidio Campi, has concentrated above all on the links between Italians and the Germanic area from 1520s until Council of Trent. I, however, document the existence of such relationships even after the Council. The second point relates to the nature of the circulation of ideas between Italy and Germany. In fact, existing scholarship focuses almost exclusively on the influence of Lutheran theology in Italy. However, as the encomium written by Camerarius and the epistle of Pseudo-Carnesecchi demonstrate, the opposite was also true. The circulation of Protestant thought was not monodirectional from Germany to Italy. After the Council of Trent, there was a reciprocity of exchanges that took inspiration from Italian personalities such as Carnesecchi himself. A few years after his death, in fact, when silence fell on him in Italy following the inquisitorial repression, in the Germanic area his figure attracted interest, so much so that his image as a hero was built on the basis of the encomium of the Italian reformer Carnesecchi. In the next 20 minutes or so, I will first present the figure of Pietro Carnesecchi and explain his role in the theological clashes in Italy between the 1530s and 1570s. Subsequently, I will analyze the so-called CIRCULUS CAMERARIORUM, that is the Camerarius family and the people who gravitated around it until 1574, the year of the death of Joachimus Camerarius Senior. As I'm going to show, the Circulus Camerariorum is noteworthy both for its intellectual profile and modes of interaction with Italy, and for its role in the reception of the figure of Carnesecchi in the German area. I will start now with the figure of Pietro Carnesecchi, Florentine. Pietro Carnesecchi represents this link, if we can say so, between Germany and Italy. His biography, as can be seen from his date of birth and death, significantly coincided with the decades of the diffusion of Lutheran thought in Italy and of the tormented Catholic Council, which opened in Trent in 1545 and concluded 13 years later in 1563. The consequences of the council were profound and had an impact not only on religious and political history, but, as is well known, had also a lasting effect on a culture and customs of the peninsula. Carnesecchi underwent 4 inquisitorial trials, but declared himself a Catholic until his death and refused both the title of Lutheran and theologian. Nonetheless, he was burned at the stake in Rome on the 1st October 1567 as a heretic. His trials are crucial events to understand the multiple identities of the Italian heterodox world between the 1540s and 1560s. In fact, his inquisitorial proceedings reveal a theological conduct and thought that we could define as oblique, not quite heretical, not quite Roman Catholic, not quite Lutheran. Carnesecchi's sort of practical theology was inspired by the precepts of Juan de Valdez, who had promoted a new spirituality, indifferent to the external and empty rites of Roman Catholicism, and who was fascinated by the concept of Lutheran justification sola gratia. Carnesecchi had met him in Naples in the 1530s and had been a follower of him, like many other illustrious personalities of that era. Therefore, his intellectual trajectory and destiny are representative of an entire generation, the Carnesecchi generation, of which few were left alive in 1566, when Carnesecchi was tried for the 4th time. Of these few survivors, some had fled Italy or, after recanting their beliefs, had aligned themselves with the post-Tridentine dogmas. The characteristic elements of this generation can be summarized in 3 essential factors. First, They were children of the early Renaissance. Therefore, they were imbued with great intellectual freedom. Second, their intense spiritual quest drew them towards or reforming ideas circulating in Europe at the time, and in particular to those by Erasmus and Luther alike. Third, they were Valdesians, that is, followers of Juan de Valdez, whose spiritual circle had flourished around the middle 1530s in Naples. Finally, it is essential to remember that Carnesecchi never wrote doctrinal works. We only have numerous letters from him in Italian to friends, acquaintances, and a theological epistle in Latin addressed to Marcantonio Flaminio, who, as I anticipated, the historiographical tradition has always considered true, despite, however, the fact that, first, the original autograph of this letter does not exist. Second, no mention of it has ever been made in any other source. Third, it was published posthumously for the first time in Nuremberg in 1571 by will of the printer Gerlach in the margin of the Epistolae aliquot Marci Antoni Flamini edited by Joachinus Camerarius. I will no more to talk about the Camerariorum CIRCULUS. Carnesecchi's death not only marked the end of an era and an entire generation in the Italian peninsula, but also reversed the circulation of ideas from south to north. His figure became a model for the German Lutherans, thanks to Camerarius, who, as I have already mentioned, wrote an encomium, and thanks to that letter signed Carnesecca, which addressed thorny doctrinal questions on the Eucharist. It was not a coincidence that this epistle appeared for the first time in Nuremberg in 1571, and that this was associated to the name of the Camerarius. In fact, the common thread that connects Camerarius to the name of Carnesecchi is something more than a faint trace, and, from the reconstruction of the story of Joachinus Camerarius Sr. and his two sons, three key aspects can be highlighted in summary. First, intellectual relationships and correspondences. Their network of acquaintances and friendships which united the Italian peninsula with Germany was extensive and relevant. Its most significant personalities included Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Giovanni Cratone, Pier Vettori, Bernardino Bonifacio Marchese Doria, Pompeo Delli Monti. Second, geography of these relationships. The mobilities of the Camerari family and of their acquaintances included numerous places, not only in the Central European area, Tübingen, Nuremberg, Bamberg, Leipzig, Wittenberg, Meissen, Bratislava, Strasbourg, but also in Italy, Padova, Venezia, Bologna, Roma, Napoli. Third, religious orientation. The Camerari were of the Lutheran confession, but in the debates that raged in Germany at the time they supported the thesis of the Philippians with moderation and discretion. I have called this word that connected Italy and Germany and produced the pseudo-epigraph letter in the name of Carnesecca, the Camerariorum CIRCULUS. Its members included Joachinus Camerarius Sr., was a learned humanist, professor of Latin and Greek, first in Nuremberg and then in Leipzig. He was a convinced Lutheran, and his friendship with Melanchthon was of ancient date. As his writings demonstrate, Camerarius entertained a strong interest in Italian culture and its internal debates. His Italian connection include most notably the name of the Florentine Pier Vettori, member of the Florentine Academy and friend of the writer Benedetto Varchi. In his Epistolae Aliquot Marci Antoni Flamini of 1571, a biography of the poet-theologian Flaminius, Camerarius placed the so-called encomium of Carnesecchi. This eulogy of Carnesecchi is modeled more on Camerarius' own religious conviction inspired by Philippism than on Carnesecchi's own ideas. In this encomium, Camerarius speaks openly of the falsity of Roman inventions, in contrast with the simple, pure, and uncorrupted doctrine of the celestial truth of Jesus Christ and the apostles, and underlines the impious practice of the Mass, which remains the worst of doctrinal errors. But there is more. Between the end of 1550 and the first half of 1560, two of his sons, Joachim Jr. and Philippus, traveled to Italy to complete their education. During their stay in the peninsula, they developed contact with persons close to Carnesecchi's heterodox world, and maintained this contact also when back in Germany. A member of this Italian heterodox world was Bonifacio, Marquis of Oria, a former follower of Valdez. After his trips to Italy, Joachim Junior Camerarius, once settled in Nuremberg to practice the profession of doctor, hosted Bonifacio, Marquis of Oria, then exiled for religious reasons in Germany. Oria shared with Carnesecchi a mutual friend, Francesco Porti, whom Carnesecchi had frequented in Venice until 1560. His younger brother, Philippus Camerarius, also traveled to Italy in the same years. Here, Philippus made direct experience of the repression against the heterodox currents of those years, but at the same time he built relationships with some of these reformers. In the autumn of 1563, Philippus left for Italy to study. After having lived for some time in Ferrara and Bologna, he reached Florence, where he was a guest and became a friend of Pier Vettori. On the 20 April 1565, he went to Rome. In June, however, he was temporarily arrested by the court of the Holy Office on an unfounded charge and locked up in the inquisitorial prison. Philippus' cellmate in Rome was a survivor of Valdesianism, Baron Pompeo degli Monti, who would be condemned to the stake as heretic in the following years. In September of the same year, Philippus Camerarius was released from prison. The fact that Philippus met Pompeo degli Monti in the Roman prisons is of considerable importance, since we know that Pompeo degli Monti had not only been an ancient follower of Juan de Valdez, but had also mixed with Carnesecchi's circle. As Philippus Camerarius' letters show, the traumatic experience of prison and his familiarity with Dellimonti marked not only his own individual conscience, but left a profound mark on those who loved him, especially his father. And perhaps it was precisely these events that suggested to his father, the old Camerarius, to draw up a short celebratory portrait of Carnesecchi. Carnesecchi, in fact, was captured just about a year after the liberation of Philippus, and in conjunction with the death sentence of Pompeo Dellimonti. The vicissitude of his son would have allowed Camerarius Senior to learn about the post-Tridentine climate in Italy, and to be acquainted with geographically and culturally distant events. In the eyes of the old Joachim Camerarius, the figure of Carnesecchi must have appeared intriguing, since he had remained loyal to his ideas in the new hostile climate established in Italy during the Council. In the encomium, this German Protestant scholar admired the firmness with which Carnesecchi, an ancient follower of Valdez, had been able to preserve his ideas even during the inquisitorial trial, and described him as a Philippist Protestant. To conclude, the encomium that Camerarius dedicated to Pietro Carnesecchi is a fundamental text for understanding the theological developments and the end of the 16th century in Europe, after the Council of Trent. Camerarius Senior had never met Carnesecchi in person, but had heard about him through his personal acquaintances and those of his children during their stays in Italy in the 1570s. We do not know what sources he drew on to reconstruct Carnesecchi's biography, but we do know that he wrote it about a year after his death, therefore in 1568. This story demonstrates that during the harsh German theological controversies of those years between supporters of Philippism and of the allegedly authentic Lutheran doctrine, German theologians made reference to some Italian personalities in support of Philippism. Since it was printed under a first name, the letter by the pseudo-Carnesecchi allowed a precise theological Philippian position to be expressed, and to date the controversy back by almost 30 years, when Luther was still alive. The prestige of the name of Carnesecchi, evidently familiar in the Germanic world, could help to moderate spirits while offering credit and authority to the Philippian position. As this letter demonstrates, after the Council of Trent, the communication between the German and Italian worlds was not interrupted, but simply reverted its trajectory. The legacy of the Italian heterodox religious thought repressed by the Council was taken on by German Protestants. Thank you for your attention.